Hello and welcome to more history stuff. Now, in my last video I gave a short account of the life and career of Edward Balliol, would-be King of Scots who died in the mid-14th century. And with this one I wanted to continue with this theme of Scottish history and related subjects and talk a bit about another Edward, and this was Edward Bruce, Earl of Carrick and High King of Ireland for a time. Younger brother of Robert the Bruce, the famous Robert the Bruce, who won the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314 and became King of Scots. But his brother Edward was also a very significant figure, particularly in Ireland. So I thought I would do a short video all about him and then maybe further videos in future. Now, I've got my coffee this morning, so I'll be taking occasional sips of that. And I also have some quite extensive notes here because Edward Bruce had a very complicated career, and I can't keep it all in my head, so every so often, as I often do in these videos, I'll be looking down at my notes, so forgive me for that. So to begin at the beginning, Edward was one of the younger brothers of Robert the Bruce, one of 5 brothers, sons of an earlier Robert the Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and Marjorie, Countess of Carrick. Now, the order of sons is uncertain. Robert was certainly the eldest, but there's some dispute over who the second, third or fourth were. All we know is that Edward was obviously a younger brother. He fought alongside Robert when Robert the Bruce revolted against Edward I in 1306 after spending 4 years in his service, and began this very long, bitter struggle for the Scottish throne. Now, this entailed fighting fellow Scots, rival Scottish factions such as the Commons and the Balliols, as well as the English. As we all know, the famous Battle of Bannockburn was fought in 1314, about 8 years later, in which the Bruces defeated Edward II. Edward Bruce played an important role there because he seems to have triggered the battle by coming to this very awkward arrangement with the English constable of Stirling Castle, basically saying that if the English king, Edward II, did not come to relieve the siege of Stirling by midsummer 1314, then the Scots would break the siege and withdraw. And this more or less forced Edward's brother Robert, who was probably quite unwell at the time, or at least that's the latest theory, to risk a pitched battle against the much larger English army against Edward II, which turned out very well for the Bruce Scots. In the end, they obviously won the battle and won this shattering victory over Edward II and the English. But it might have turned out to be a disaster. It could have been a terrible Scottish defeat. And if the theory is correct, that the whole thing was triggered by Edward Bruce's slightly clumsy bargaining, then the whole thing would have been his fault. But as it turned out, the Scots won, and it was fine. Now, other than the Battle of Bannockburn, Edward was also entrusted with his older brother Robert with destroying their enemies in Scotland. Now, this, as you may imagine, was a fairly brutal process, the times being what they were. Edward was put in charge of attacking the Earl of Buchan, one of the common faction, soon after the death of Edward I of England. Buchan was a Plantagenet loyalist. He had chosen to fight for the English, or rather the Balliol faction, as well as the English. The politics are very complex, and Robert ordered Edward Bruce to ravage the lands of Buchan in the east of Scotland, completely plunder and destroy everything, slaughter the peasantry, and drive Buchan out of Scotland. And this was known as the harrying or the hership of Buchan, a very brutal ravaging campaign, typical of medieval military tactics. Rather than fighting battles, which were generally a last resort, the idea was to waste your opponent's land, to kill his peasants, destroy his crops, carry off the cattle, deprive him of money and supplies, because if he could do that, then he would no longer have a capacity to fight. He would no longer be able to raise soldiers or pay or feed them. And this is exactly what Edward does, very efficiently, very brutally. And then he does it again in Galloway, in southwest Scotland, where many of the local lords refuse to accept the Bruce kingship, and remain loyal to their Balliol lords, because Galloway was a Balliol heartland. Robert once again sends Edward Bruce to sort this problem out, and another very brutal, ravaging campaign follows, in which most of the lords of Galloway who oppose the Bruces are either destroyed or driven out, with great slaughter, loss of life. It cannot be emphasised enough just how brutal the warfare was in this period, and that applies everywhere: Scotland, England, France, anywhere where war is being waged. This is always the style of it. It's extremely brutal, and it's generally the civilians and the non-combatants who suffered. So those are Edward Bruce's main actions in Scotland. In 1315, he took the most significant action of his life, and he went over to Ireland. And this is where I start looking at my notes, because the Irish situation is particularly complex. Now, Ireland was technically ruled by the kings of England, who had conquered it under Henry II. But that's a very blanket statement, because the English only really had effective control of Dublin and the Pale of Dublin, the land surrounding the city. And then anything sort of outside of that, the marches of Ireland, Ulster, the rest of the country, was more or less in flux, in which Anglo-Norman nobles, the descendants of the original colonists, and Welsh colonists as well, it must be said, were in a constant state of warfare against the Irish lords, the Gaelic lords, who were either fighting the colonists or fighting each other. It's a very turbulent land, Ireland, in a more or less constant state of warfare and feuding and cattle raiding and so forth. Edward goes there to be recognised as High King, which was quite remarkable, really, because there had been no recognised High King for decades, if not a century. I mean, various Irish lords, such as Hugh O'Neill, had declared themselves High King in the late 13th century, but they hadn't really got anywhere, and they'd been killed before any sort of permanent kingship could be set up. But this is what Edward Bruce does. He is invited over by an Irish king, whose name I will probably mispronounce, Domhnall Mac Brian O'Neill, one of the kings of present-day Ulster. And he and a number of his vassals and allies requested aid from Scotland, because the English were attacking the lands of the O'Neills in Ulster, and they wanted Scottish help to push the English out. Now, as far as the Bruces were concerned, this was an opportunity to open a second front in Ireland, which would distract English resources and oblige Edward II to fight a war on two fronts, in both Scotland and Ireland, rather than just Scotland, as well as his concerns elsewhere in Wales and France, and split his forces. So this is as much a strategic decision by the Bruces, as much as a sort of pan-Gaelic alliance against the English, which is how they framed it. They were very clever in their use of sort of language and propaganda. And at first, Edward Bruce does astonishingly well. He and his Irish allies, they win battle after battle in Ireland. They inflict a number of very severe defeats on Edward II's forces in Ireland, which are led by Roger Mortimer, the Earl of March, who would ironically end up deposing his boss, his master, Edward II, several years later. But at this point he's still loyal, and he's forced to fight this very difficult war in Ireland, in which he and his forces are really pushed back to begin with in the first year or so after Edward the Bruce's arrival in 1315. The Bruce Scots and their Irish allies, they sweep all before them, really, That is until 1317, when a famine hits Ireland, a very bad famine, and that affects both sides and causes the war to bog down and grind to a halt, which, while it's very bad news for everyone, it does at least give Edward II's followers in Ireland an opportunity to recover and rush over supplies and reinforcements from England. Bear in mind, I'm giving a very broad picture of what happened in Ireland, of this Irish War of Edward Bruce, because it is very complicated and very detailed, and I can only give a general overview in a video like this. But this is the basic sort of broad sweep of events. As I return to my notes, as I say, the English, or the Anglo-Irish, were able to recover. And in the meantime, Edward Bruce had sent a petition, or a remonstrance, to the Pope, John the 22nd, in Rome, basically asking for Rome to formally recognise him as High King of Ireland and revoke the earlier papal support that had been given to Henry II, the King of England, when he initially invaded Ireland in the 12th century. Rome had sanctioned that invasion and basically approved of the Plantagenet English conquest of Ireland. And in 1317, Edward Bruce tries to persuade the current Pope to revoke that and instead support his claim to the High Kingship. But the Pope refuses. He refuses to recognise Edward's claim. He also refuses to pay any attention to the remonstrance itself, which is basically a list of complaints against the allegedly oppressive rule of the English in Ireland. And he basically rejects all of these petitions from Edward Bruce and his Irish allies. So this, in diplomatic terms, is a major setback for Edward Bruce. Here's where I take a sip of coffee. And you could argue that it's the first major failure, even though he's been doing very well on the battlefield in sort of tactical terms. He cannot win the diplomatic battle. He cannot persuade anyone outside Ireland, particularly the Pope, who really matters, to recognise Edward Bruce, the High Kingship of Edward Bruce as High King of Ireland. And this is followed by another and far greater disaster, a military one this time. As I said, so far the Bruces and their allies had pretty much won every battle. Although they hadn't managed to win the war, the Anglo-Irish are still sort of clinging on to their main strongholds in Ireland, despite suffering repeated defeats. And in the aftermath of this terrible famine in 1317, one of Edward II's loyalist nobles, an Anglo-Irishman called Sir John Birmingham, raises another army and marches against Edward Bruce. And they meet in a pitched battle at Forghart on the 14th of October 1318. And this time the Anglo-Irish win, and this is a really shattering defeat for the Scots and the Irish, or their Irish allies, because the Irish were fighting on both sides. It's not a straightforward Gaelic versus English conflict by any means. And the Scots-Irish army is wiped out, really. We don't have many details for what actually happened at Forghart, but the longest version of the battle from the Annals of Ulster says that Edward Bruce set up his army in 3 divisions. Sorry, this is from the Chronicle of Lanercost, an English account. This says that Edward Bruce set up his army in 3 divisions, but they were too widely spaced apart to support each other. So it seems that he set up his army quite badly on the day, and the Anglo-Irish were able to attack and defeat each division in turn before destroying the final division, led by Edward Bruce himself. And he was actually killed in the fighting, and afterwards his body was abused very badly. He was beheaded, the body was cut into quarters, and the head sent to London as a trophy to Edward II. So this was really a bit of an anti-Bannockburn, if you like. It was a really awful defeat, not only for the pro-Bruce Irish in Ireland, or any of the Irish who wished to drive out the Plantagenets, to drive out the English and their supporters. But it was a shocking defeat for the Bruces. And this was after 15 years or so of sustained success, particularly in Scotland, where they had inflicted one defeat after another upon Edward II. Finally, the tables had turned, at least in Ireland, and Edward II, although he wasn't there, he didn't actually win the battle himself. This is still very much a victory for his cause. And that pretty much spelt the end of Bruce ambitions in Ireland. Which doesn't mean that the Bruce expedition to Ireland was a complete disaster. I mean, the battle didn't resolve everything, and this warfare rumbled along for generations afterwards. But it did spell the immediate end of Bruce ambitions, and there were no more high kings in Ireland. Edward Bruce was the last. So the Battle of Falkirk was decisive in that sense. And that was the end of the career of Edward Bruce, a very bloody end. So, yeah, that was it. He was cut to pieces on the field of Falkirk, and you can still see his tomb in Ireland. It's still there if you want to go and look at it. Very poignant. So that was the end of another very bloody episode in this period of British and Irish history. As I said, a very general overview. Apologies for any mistakes. Feel free to comment below, like and subscribe if you like this video. If not, then not. And I'll see you next time. Thank you.